Andy Evans, who is the chief executive of Queen's Park Rangers in the community. And he said, the church is in our DNA. And in the way that we are reaching out to the community, we are continuing the work of the church in doing the same at that time. So yes, God is still active, and clubs are aware of their debt to the churches and the influences that live on.
Hello and welcome to Onside, where faith meets football, brought to you by Good News Broadcasting. As per usual, I'm Eamon, and with me is my co-host Warner. And this episode is part 2 of our conversation with Peter Lupson on the different football clubs that can trace their roots back to Christian groups or churches. So if you've missed part 1, I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode and come back. But here's the conclusion of our conversation. It's fascinating to see how these clubs started in that churches or within Christian organizations and whatnot, how strong that Christian element was in those early days. And so then at what point did that start to kind of fade out? Was it a slow, gradual process, or was there kind of just a certain point where it kind of just became its own separate entity and it just kind of died off quite quickly?
A mixture of the two, Eamon. As a rule, the clubs maintained a very close link with their churches, certainly in the first 12, 13 years. Now, I'll take one or two clubs individually, so that it's better to give examples than just to speak generally. Aston Villa was originally known as the Aston Villa Wesleyan FC because it's named after the chapel that it was founded by, the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel. It's got nothing to do with the area. It's simply the name of the chapel. It still plays in that name. So they've never, ever changed the name like some of the clubs have done. Now, what was interesting was the fact that although, the club eventually went on to bigger things, the connection was one that remained a connection of the heart. So in May 1935, when the chapel commemorated its 70th anniversary, the chairman of Aston Villa, the secretary of Aston Villa, and players all attended that service. In other words, this is where we belong. So that went on. And I'll go on to one or two of the others now. Everton. Now, that's an interesting case because they changed their name after 1 year. And the reason was that as St. Domingo FC, which is where they started, they became the best team in the area and began to attract the best players from other church teams. And it was felt that the club's name was no longer representative of all the players. So they agreed to change it a year later to Everton, because that was the district where most of them lived. Now, you'd have thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. In fact, the link between Everton and subsequently Liverpool and St. Domingo Church continued for many, many years. So the first example is that when Everton split from Liverpool and became Everton in 1892 and Liverpool became Liverpool in 1892, the first chairman of Everton was the organist of St. Domingo Chapel. Wow. And so that link was still strong. And he was involved very much in the work of the chapel, because even after he stopped being the organist, he was still involved in selecting subsequent organists. Will Cuff, who had been the choir master and had been in the choir as a boy, was the chairman of Everton in 1928, when it was the club's Jubilee anniversary, 50th anniversary. And where was the service held? It was held at St. Domingo Chapel to remember where they had come from. In 1935, that's 57 years after the club was formed, one of the first players who was in the St. Domingo team and then continued playing as Everton, he was the son of one of the trustees, and that this trustee had laid the foundation stone of the chapel. And this is what's recorded in the minutes of the 17th of December, 1935, the club directors' minutes. Mr. A.R. Wade reminded the board that the Everton Club originated at St. Domingo Church, Everton in 1878, that his father, the late Joseph Wade, had laid the foundation stone of that church, and that on that occasion he was presented with a trowel and mallet. Mr. Wade expressed a wish that the board, on behalf of the shareholders, would accept from him these mementos of that interesting event. Now, that trowel and mallet have been on display at the Everton Club, showing that these are symbols of where we come from. And do you know, before the First World War, and right until after the Second World War, Everton and Liverpool football clubs worshipped together once a year on what was called Football Sunday, where at St. Domingo Chapel. So the incredible thing is that the influence lived on. They might have not been legally attached anymore, but they were still emotionally and spiritually attached. So they're two examples. Now, there are many others, and I don't know really how much time we've got, but I'll just mention, for example, Queen's Park Rangers, because believe it or not, part of that name incorporates one of the two church clubs that formed them, Christchurch Rangers. Now, Queen's Park Rangers were formed as a merger of St. Jude's Institute, FC, which was a mission at the heart of the Queen's Park estate, and it was opened by St. Jude's Church, and Christchurch Rangers, because Christchurch was a mission opened by St. John the Evangelist Church in nearby College Park. Those two merged, but there was a real problem because the vicar of St. Jude's had allowed the St. Jude's Institute FC to use that building as their HQ. When the clubs merged, it continued to be the HQ. And many of the Christchurch Rangers players left, saying this is a takeover. It's not a merger. We're still effectively St. Jude's Institute. And so a resolution was reached, which was that we've got to show that both teams are equally valid. And they changed the name to Queen's Park, the area where most of them lived, and put Rangers at the end to show the Christchurch Rangers players that they were as important as the St. Jude's Institute. St. Jude's Institute did remain the headquarters until the club became a limited company. But the fact that the word Rangers appears in the title is because of the church, Christchurch, where this half of the club was formed. Where there might be a formal break with the club, for example, when it either goes professional or when it becomes a limited company, you might think that's the end. But as we saw with Everton, it wasn't. And again, with Aston Villa, it wasn't. And now, of course, with Queen's Park Rangers, some of the earliest players eventually became directors of the club. And one of them was the vice chairman of the club. He was only 12, believe it or not, when he first played for the team. And this is something else that is worth mentioning. There was no kind of, you've all got to be within 2 or 3 years of each other. The first team at St. Jude's Institute, there was Albert Pearsall, who was 12, and Harry Creeber, who was 20. And they were playing in the same team because it was fun. It wasn't meant to be anything serious. But Pearsall eventually became a director, and he was vice chairman until his death in 1946. So you can see that the link has continued there. I mean, there are other clubs I could mention, but I think 3 is enough as an example.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So have you managed to speak with any clubs kind of recently and touch base and see, because you mentioned earlier on that some of them are surprised that they have these links. So have you managed to speak with any clubs and see kind of how they find that at the moment?
I've managed to make contact and have a good relationship with all 12 in my book. So, for example, when it was decided to do a TV documentary based on the book, We visited all 12 clubs. We were allowed to film in their grounds undisturbed. We were given the help of some of the club historians. The clubs also provided us with video clips, materials, photographs, and it was a wonderful time, actually, because they so appreciated where they came from. In fact, the club historian of one of the clubs said to me, publicly, actually said this at a launch, he said, if I'd done my job properly, you wouldn't have had so much work to do. And that was a very generous statement to make. Now, it was a thrill to meet these clubs and to let them know the missing elements of their history. And I can tell you that some lovely stories here. First of all, I mentioned Aston Villa again, who still play in the name of the chapel. They had a very powerful Christian man in their ranks in the early years called William McGregor. He was the man who founded the Football League, the first football league in the world. And on the 100th anniversary of his death, I contacted the clubs who were the founding members of the Football League, and we had a special service of Thanksgiving for the life of McGregor on the 100th anniversary of his death. And we also restored his grave. Now, to show the recognition of the church influences in both the life of the club and the life of William McGregor, the service was conducted by these clergy people: the Bishop of Aston, the President of the Methodist Conference, because Aston Villa is of Methodist origin, the moderator of the General Assembly of the URC, because William McGregor worshipped in a congregational church, which eventually was absorbed with the Presbyterians into the URC, the minister of Ardoch Church, Braco, where McGregor was baptized, the chaplain of Aston Villa Football Club, the rector of St. Mary's, which is where the ceremony was held. Now, there was a public recognition that these churches, and they were represented by very, very senior figures, were instrumental in creating the atmosphere in which football was played. And Lord Morwinnie, who was the chairman of the Football League, attended that service and addressed the audience. Now, that was a big event, and it went on TV and so on, but some of the others did as well. Bolton Wanderers, when my book made it clear that their founder was lying in a neglected grave near where the church was that started the club, they immediately set about to restore his grave, and we had a Thanksgiving service for his life there. And a year later, he was inducted into their Walkway of Fame, which was outside what was then called the Reebok Stadium, where there are bricks with names of people on, and he was inducted into that. Fulham, they had a public unveiling of a plaque within St. Andrew's Church to commemorate the role of that church in its foundation, and that was in 2013. And one of the people who unveiled the plaque was George Cohen, a member of obviously a Fulham player, but also an England World Cup winner in 1966. Queen's Park Rangers, on their 125th anniversary, plaque outside St. Jude's Institute, and it was unveiled by one of their great players and other big speakers. And the player concerned was the legendary Stan Bowles. I know you guys are much younger than me, but I'm sure you know that name. 125th anniversary of the founding of Southampton, service at the church where it was founded. Swindon Town restored Pitt's grave, and a Thanksgiving service was held at that church where the grave, in the church's graveyard, in 2011. And Tottenham, when they discovered from my book that their founder had been buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, immediately set about giving him a headstone. And there was a public service in Dover where he's buried, And people, Spurs supporters came from everywhere, including the Isle of Wight and so on. Now, at Everton again, I forgot to mention that the Reverend who set the ball rolling, he was inducted into their Hall of Fame. And the grave that I found, which was devastatingly derelict, was restored jointly by Everton and Liverpool at a joint ceremony in Yorkshire, where players of both clubs represented the two sides. And these are just some of the examples. And there are many others. But yes, the short answer, and not the long one, was yes, these clubs recognize where they've come from and have honored the people to whom they are indebted.
Well, it's good to hear that they are restoring graves and holding services and things to kind of acknowledge the kind of the Christian influence in that. Because ultimately, as we've mentioned earlier, there doesn't seem to be on the surface, for someone who hasn't kind of read your book or looked at the documentary or kind of done any research for themselves, it does look like there isn't a Christian influence at all in the world of football. And so do you think God still has a big part in the game today? I know certain clubs have chaplains and different things like that. Do you think the church has a big part in the game today? And how, if so, how do you think the church has a big part in the game today?
Well, clearly, I mentioned earlier about Christians in sport. There is a growing number of Christian football players, and they have regular input from the Christians in sport people, Bible studies and so on. But one of the big influences is really the chaplains. Now, we cannot underestimate how important they are. They are there to give spiritual help, emotional help, any kind of help. Players are ordinary people. Marriages break down, loved ones die, and so on. And they also conduct carol services every Christmas, which again are well supported. I know that one of the chaplains has a prayer session regularly with players and the manager, and sometimes before a match. Not they want to win, but that they play in the right spirit. They have a very significant role. And one of the other ways in which they become involved is through work in the community. Now, many community programs include trying to get young kids off the street, off drugs, out of the pubs, looking after their health, correcting antisocial behavior, getting involved with crime issues, dementia, disability, all these sorts of things. And many of the chaplains are involved in these community programs. I'll just give you two quotes to conclude that, really. Robert Elstone, who was the chief executive of Everton until not too long ago, told me that in their particular work in the community, they are perpetuating the spirit of Ben Chambers, who was the minister of St. Domingo Chapel, whose outreach to the community was much appreciated. And he said that, I hope Chambers will be proud of us doing what we're doing today as a continuity of what he started. And then I also interviewed Andy Evans, who is the chief executive of Queen's Park Rangers in the community. And I asked him, is he aware of the influence of the church in the club and what he's doing now? And he said, very much. The church is in our DNA. And in the way that we are reaching out to the community, we are continuing the work of the church in doing the same at that time. So yes, God is still active, and clubs are aware of their debt to the churches and the influences that live on.
That's really good. So just wrapping up and kind of following on from that, what at the moment excites you about what God's doing in football, and maybe that's whether that's involved in what you're directly involved in or not? And then following on from that, what can we as co-hosts and also, listeners of this podcast be praying about for you at this time?
Well, one thing that really encouraged me was that the National Football Museum wanted to do a an exhibition at the football, at its headquarters in Manchester, telling the story of the role of the church in the creation of football clubs. And they also wanted to take it around the country as a touring exhibition. Unfortunately, the personnel who wanted to set that up left, and then we had COVID and everything fell apart. But there was that recognition in something as important as the National Football Museum that this is a story that should be told. And I was, in fact, invited to address the National Football Museum at the launch of my DVD. They hosted it, and it was attended by people such as John Motson, Cyril Regis, who was a great Aston Villa player. And this acceptance of Christian influences in the world of football then and now is something that excites me, because at the moment, Christianity isn't given a very good press generally. And it's great that it doesn't seem to be affecting the world of football. The world of football is increasingly becoming involved in making clear that God is still there. And there's an organization called Faith in Football, is it Faith and Football, with Linvoy Primus and others. And they are having a big effect. And I've noticed that when Portsmouth had lots of Christian players in at the time, they've had a profound impact. And those players have gone on to have an impact in the clubs they've gone to. I think very much what we should be praying for is that hearts and minds in the clubs are open in the first instance to the chaplains. They're the first port of call people ever think of in connection with church. And that the bad press that Christians are getting nowadays, that is counteracted by awareness of the good things that Christians are doing, serving the community, poverty, helping. I know that one of the churches near us opens its doors for people who can't afford to be warm because of the high cost of heating and so on. Things like this. Ask God to show people that he is at work in the good things the church is doing. And he wants to reach out to all and invites all to become his friend.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this conversation. It's honestly fascinating to hear how Christianity has played a massive part in some of the biggest football clubs here in the UK and even the world, really. And so for those who would like to learn more about this topic, you can find Peter's book, Thank God for Football, on Amazon or wherever else you buy your books. And his documentary series of the same name is free to watch on YouTube, so you can go check that out. But thanks very much for joining us, Peter. It's honestly been an absolute pleasure to have you on. And if you'd like more biblical-based podcasts and programs, just simply head over to our website, gnba.net. That's gnba.net. But thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next one.